that shouldn't say the first. That shouldn't say Mark 1. That should be Mark 14. Oh, man. See, this is how Satan tries to get you. Like, I had a tough week. We all had a tough week. We lost power here last week because of the windstorm, and then all sorts of stuff. I had court on the 2nd, fighting a suspended license, which thankfully the DA, when I met with them, he looked it over and he was like, yeah, I showed him, I said, I paid it, but evidently it crossed the mail. I never got a thing that said I had to pay more or whatever. And so they dismissed it, so that's a good thing. But it was one of those things where this week, it was like Satan kind of sitting there, like, I'm going to jab you. And of course, I'm thinking I had all this time trying to do this, and you mess up, we're human. But we're in chapter 14 of Mark, and this is the thing that I'm going to say. So for this next month, we are in chapter 14. Chapter 14 is 70 plus verses. This is our last, what I've been calling our dump, our sermon dump or whatever, because there's 25 of these verses that we're going to do today. Then we're going to kind of get back into being able to relax and do like shorter portions. But this is an interesting portion. This is it. This is like the beginning of Jesus' last night. This is the beginning of the end of the Gospel of Mark. It's the beginning of the end of everything. We're going up to Easter. We're going to be finishing. The way we've got this, we're going to have a Good Friday service. Good Friday service, it just happened the way as I was working the sermons out last year for this year and going through this, it so happened that if I said, okay, I'm going to do a Good Friday service, Good Friday was the crucifixion, Easter is the resurrection, and then we have Mark's version of the Great Commission the following week, and then we're going to be in our new series, which if you haven't seen the banner out here, we're going to go into the Old Testament. We've spent a lot of time in the New Testament. We're going to go in the Old Testament and kind of see where God works, everything that we've been studying through the different lives of people that he has been a part of. So, here's where we're going to be. We're going to be seeing that this is it. So 14 and 15 basically cover like 24 to 36 hours of this time period. This is going in, it's actually a little bit before. We're going to see that there's actually the night before and then we go into the day before. But what's interesting is this is a very intense part of the Scriptures. This is a very intense part because there is a lot of emotion in here. There's a lot of things. Back in 2004, I remember Natalie was going through her first cancer surgery, where they were first removing a tumor. It was on her side, and the surgery was 11 hours. It was a very complicated surgery. And we were like, okay, how is this going to work? And I'm sitting there, and throughout the day, her parents are there, my dad was there, her grandparents came in, her uncle came in, like everybody was giving me support. And finally, like at 7 o'clock, me and my dad are like the last two left. My dad, for those who don't know, my dad was a pastor, so he kind of like took the dad hat off and kind of put like sideways his pastor hat to pray with me and keep me, focused on what was going on. Because we were worried. The doctor kept coming out and he'd be like, well, it's a little more complicated than we thought. At the time, they ended up removing ribs and some muscle and other things because the cancer was so evasive in her body. And so finally, at 7 o'clock, he comes out and he's like, okay, it's done. We've got it all, we think. We're gonna keep her boss at the time had given a personal number because he wanted to know, are you going to be in the next day? And I called him up. I said, well, this is the thing. It's been an 11-hour surgery. I'm not going to see her until tomorrow. So he's like, why don't you take a couple of days off? I'm going to talk to the president and get you paid days off for this. And he's a really great guy, good beer, lovely guy. So I go home, and of course, I go home and I'm hungry. So I stop. I get myself something to eat at the sub shop. I get home. I go to open up the sub, and my phone's ringing, and I'm like, okay, and I pick it up, and it's Natalie's grandmother. And she's like, where are you? Natalie's at the thing, she's been asking for you. And I'm like, well, the doctor told me to go home because I'm not going to be able to see her. And she's like, well, you got to go back, you got to see her. So I'm living in Taunton. She had the surgery in Brockton, so I got to travel now like 25 minutes back to Brockton. It's now like 9 o'clock. I'm walking in there. She's like wide awake, and oh. And she's, why weren't you here? I'm here. I'm here now. Now, I bring this up because after she decided she was too tired to spend time with me, and I had already ate, and I knew I wasn't going into work the next day, there happened to be a little movie called Passion of Christ that came out that day. And so I decided I was going to go and see that. Natalie jokes about this, like there's no greater way that, your wife facing death on the surgery table than, to have her survive and go watch Passion of Christ. But that's what I was. And I remember that movie, and this is why I bring it up, because there was so much emotion in that. There was so much stuff going on in that story of Christ. And, Mel Gibson, love him or hate him, he's human, he's screwed up his life, but God let him make this awesome movie. And this movie, I can remember because I remember sitting there watching this, and then afterwards, there were like 3 gangbanger type kids over this way from me, and they were weeping at this movie. They were weeping at what they had just seen. And so I bring that up because we're beginning this. This is like a very intense portion of Scripture. So let's just jump right in there. I'm going to read from the screen, just so all right. So here it is. It's 14, 1 through 25. It was now 2 days before the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, and he was reclining at a table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment and pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor, and they scolded her. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. And on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. And wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, Where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples. And he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready there, prepared for us. And the disciples set out and went to the city and found it, just as he had told them. And they prepared the Passover. And when it was evening, he came with the 12. And as they were reclining at a table and eating, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be sorrowful and said to him, one after another, "Is it I?" He said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the dish with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." And as they were eating, he took the bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he said to them, after they all drank it, he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." So we have this interesting portion of Scripture where we're going through this. This is it. We're studying the Passover and the Lord's Supper. And the first part we see is we see that there's this anointing and betrayal. We look at this, and here's what it says. Now, 2 days before the Passover, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." And you got to understand what was going on at the time. They were looking for Messiah. They knew that Messiah was supposed to be there. And they saw Jesus. The people recognized Jesus as a Messiah, not the Messiah. See, the Jewish people, just to remind you, they were looking for a warrior, a king, somebody in the mold of David. They weren't thinking what God said about the heart of David, where David had this heart that was purely worshipful for God, which understood that he was a sinner and he couldn't live up to all the things that needed to be. So the chief priests and the scribes, they were scared. They thought to themselves, if we arrest him, there's going to be a riot, and this is going to be bad. They were thinking press. You know, we think about the press and TV and how they like to spin things on certain things. Think of how it would have been if Jesus was today and how that would react. You know, like all of a sudden Jesus gets arrested and it just turns into a PR nightmare for the Pharisees. That's what they were looking at. The key here is Judas. We look at it and it says, jump up, and it says, "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them." Now that's because he was thinking that Jesus was this warrior Messiah. He didn't realize that he was the Messiah. He didn't realize that until after he betrayed him. We got to understand, Judas was one of the 12. He had done miracles. He was there. He was one of the ones sent out. So he had healed sick. He had made blind see. You know, whatever it was that God twice, Jesus sends out the 72 and the 120. So twice he sent out the apostles to already kind of do the schoolwork. He gave them semi-final tests to kind of see, can you do this? Can you do what I've been training you to do? And obviously he had passed, because he never left. There were groups that had left. He never left. He was also trusted with the money of the group. So there was some trust in him, even though scholars will say he was a thief. But Jesus trusted him to take the money. But he sought to betray him. Part of it is because he thought that Jesus was not a Messiah, not the one he was looking for. We look at what Jesus says about him. It says, "For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he were not born." Now the sad part about that is this. When you look at how Judas reacts after Jesus is betrayed, he goes, and what does he do? He hangs himself. He realized his error. I have a mentor who used to say to me, "Could you imagine the gospel that would have been written if Judas had not done that?" There's two contrasts to this. There's Judas' story and there's Peter's story. We're going to see Peter in the coming month. But Peter is told that he's going to deny Jesus 3 times, and he does. Peter goes off and mourns. He's like heartbroken by what he does. And then Peter goes on to become one of the big leaders of the church. After Jesus takes him back and forgives him, Peter goes on to become one of the big leaders of the church. He writes 2 letters in the New Testament that are used by the church still today to equip us. He goes on to mentor John Mark, who wrote this gospel in Peter's account. If Judas had not hung himself and asked Jesus for forgiveness, could you imagine how that would feel? Especially for those of us who have gone through that and understood the forgiveness that Jesus gives us, that God gives us through the sacrifice of Jesus. How that would have been. But Jesus, being God, knows that he's not going to seek that, and that there's this side here that is very hard for us to understand, but Judas is going to give up in his own life. He's going to take his own life. In contrast, we see this woman. Now, this woman who goes before Jesus and takes the bottle and breaks it. Now, this woman, as it is, many scholars believe that it could be Mary Magdalene, or that it could be Mary, the sister of Martha. This is happening at Simon the leper's house. There is a parallel in the Gospel of John where it names Mary. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, same stuff that we see in Mark, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of perfume. We look at this, what is this nard? What is this stuff that is going on? Now, Jesus goes ahead and he says, she's preparing me for my burial. This is what he talks about. This is him, it's now 2 days before his execution on the cross. And what happens is, he's sitting there and he's looking at this as she's preparing my body. What would happen with the body, when they would take it down, they would wrap it up and they would put in different flowers and oils and stuff to hide the scent of the dead body. When Jesus resurrects Lazarus, there's this thing where Mary looks at him, and as much as she's trying and wants Jesus to raise him from the dead, he sits there and he says, "Okay, roll the stone away." And Mary's like, "Lord, surely he stinketh." It's like, he's been in there 3 days, his body's been rotting. And these oils and ointments and flowers and different things that they used was used to kind of try to hide that smell, because it wasn't like today where we just put somebody in a coffin and then bury them 6 feet under. There were different elements at work here. And what Jesus sits there and says is that she's going to be known for this. I like to think that there's a difference with the anointing too, is that she's anointing him because he's about ready to go to this weird cross, which a lot of people see as Jesus' throne. And Jesus is going to be put to death because he's king. So she's like anointing him as king. The Sanhedrin didn't see him as king, but she saw him as king. She saw him as Messiah. We see what Jesus says. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. And here we are talking about it. Next, we're going to talk about the Passover. Now, the Passover was a feast that they did. It's one of their feasts. One thing about the Jewish religion is they celebrate with feasts. The feasts talk about their holidays. You know, we as Christians, we celebrate Christmas and Easter. And then we have celebrations as a country. We do the 4th of July, and we have Thanksgiving, Memorial Day, Veterans Day. There are these holidays that we have, you know, throughout the year. Same thing happened. So here, this is what it says. On the first day of unleavened bread, so they have, it's this week-long celebration that they do. The first day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And they sacrificed the Passover lamb, which was representative of what happened with in the Exodus with Moses, where God told him to take the lamb, sacrifice it, take the blood, put it on the doorpost so that the angel of death could pass over wherever the firstborn was. That's what was going on. And so we see, it says, where Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he sent his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, and the teacher says, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? All right? So here he is. You notice there's a parallel between this and the triumphal entry. The triumphal entry, he told the apostles, the disciples, you know, go down and get the colt and everything. There's like this similarity between the beginning of the Passion Week and the end of the Passion. Jesus is telling them, go and do this. Because Jesus knows that everything has been prepared for them by the Father. But in this, they're going to celebrate this Passover feast. And it's something that Mark tells us that Jesus wanted to do. This was like a big celebration. Now, here it is in Exodus. This is why they do this. This day shall be for you a memorial day. So we were just talking about memorial days, right? And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast. So this is what Jesus wanted to do. He wanted to celebrate this because it was this meal, this celebration, this thing that his Father had given them to do. But there was also more, because the Passover also is representative of what the Messiah is going to do. There is the Passover lamb, and Jesus is that sacrificial lamb. His blood is going to be the payment for our sin. So there's all this vision and imagery that's going on at this feast that's going to happen. And we're going to see that as we go into the elements of the Lord's Supper. But before that, he sits there, and of course we bring up the betrayal, the betrayer. He comes up and he's going to give them one more prophecy. It's going to be the prophecy of this betrayal. And when it was evening, he came to the 12, and as they were reclining at the table, I got to look, because that just looks weird. At the table and eating, Jesus said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. And they began to be sorrowful and say to him, one after another, is it I? He said to them, It is one of the 12 who is dipping bread into the dish with him. Okay. Just realize that. Just kind of. What happened there? Okay, we're gonna have to go this way. Oh, that's not even there. All right. So let me get in. I got to learn, this is a whole new program, so just bear with me on this. So here's what the thing is. Jesus is sitting there, he's talking about the betrayer, he's talking about where they are, and how this goes with them. Now, think about this. As they're sitting there and they're eating, they're having this great time, they're celebrating this feast before the Lord. And Jesus tells them, one of you is going to betray me. And they don't know who it is. They really don't know who that person is. Let's see if this works. And how that works to them. How that is. For them, they're sitting there and they're enjoying this time. They're with their best friend. They're with Jesus. Jesus has done all this stuff. They've spent all this time with him. And Jesus, he's already fighting emotion. We're going to see this in the Garden of Gethsemane. He fights his human side. There's this part of God which we don't understand with the Son, being fully God and fully man, where this human side of him is going to fight with him about being the person that doesn't want to give up the body, but then says, not my will, but your will, Father. He loves God so much. He loves the Father so much. He sits there and he says, this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to do your will. So at this time, there's this emotional time. Those disciples are sitting there. Is it I? Is it I? And it's just sorrowful. So you can imagine that they're crying. Is it I? You know, John. You've got a picture of John, who's the youngest of the disciples. He's sitting there. He's like Jesus' little brother. Jesus gives him the charge that a son would have over a mother. He says, you will take care of my mother. You can just see him being like, is it I? Don't tell me it's me. There's this emotion that's built up. But he tells them, it's the one that dips with me. And I have the verse, but it shows, the other Gospels show that it's Judas that dips. And when Judas dips in the dish with him, the disciples, they're looking and they're like, and Judas doesn't fight it. That's the one thing. Judas does not fight what happens. Judas sits there and he is just sitting there trying to do what it is that he thinks is right. And Jesus says to him, go and do what you must. And he doesn't fight it. He goes. He goes ready to go and betray Jesus. So now we go into the Lord's Supper. We see what the text says. If I can get back down there. All right. And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to them and said, take, this is my body. And he took the cup, and he gave thanks, and he said to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. So, I'm going to tell you, this is where the imagery happens. So they're doing the Passover Seder, and in the Passover Seder, there is a portion of the unleavened bread which they hide. and it's for the guest, as they call it. And there's, depending on which tradition of Judaism you're in, they have 4 or 5, sometimes a 6th cup. And that cup is either the cup of Mary or the cup of Elisha or the cup of Moses. And no one drinks of that cup. Those are put aside. What we believe, what scholars believe, is that Jesus took from that cup and he gave it to them all to drink, including himself, and of that hidden bread for the guests, to signify that I am Messiah. What you have been waiting for is about to be fulfilled. They took of that element, and he tells them, do this in remembrance of me. This is what we're going to celebrate today. We celebrate the fulfillment of Jesus' sacrifice. We celebrate the fulfillment of what God had given Moses. Moses is, and we're going to see this after we're done with Mark. We're going to go into the story of God. We're going to see that God in the Old Testament showed us many sort of messiahs, not the fake messiahs that we see in Judaism that came up. But there are these people who were men and even women of God that did stuff for the people, that God gave us this element of this is what is going to happen. We see it with David, we see it with Samson, we see it with Noah, we see it with Esther, we see it with Gideon. There are all these people. But now, after all this time, Jesus is sitting there and he celebrates it by taking these elements. So now I think if somebody can go out the door, I think I've heard them. We're going to take time to prepare for communion. We're going to do things probably a little differently for some of you. I know that we've had things where we've tried to understand, but let me explain for you the Lord's Supper. So the Lord's Supper we have open to any believer, any person who believes in Jesus Christ. What we do a little bit differently, what I want to do a little bit differently, you'll see that there is a little trash bucket down here. This is a tradition that I have from one of our other churches. What we did was, rather than bring the elements to the people in the seats, because this is a symbol of Christ's sacrifice to us, and because the way the church is designed is that the table is like the altar, and because we have the cross on there where Christ sacrificed, the elements are right there. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to pray, I will read the scripture, and I will ask you all to come up. Take one of the bread, cracker, and drink, and go over and just think, take the element, and then put the cup in the trash bag. And then go back to your seat. Now I'm going to ask you to examine, like, this is what Paul writes. He writes in Corinthians 11 that we are to examine ourselves and then so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. You know, we need to be right with God before we do that. So I'm going ask us all right now to take a little time, prepare ourselves for the communion, and then I will begin playing a little bit of music in the background, and I will go down and I will take the things off, the covers off the elements, and we will then take, get up from your seat and come and take the elements. All right? So take a few minutes to examine for yourself, prepare yourself.
The Savior said, thy strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in me thine all in all. Jesus paid it all to help my own. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. In me I found thy power, and thine alone can change the leper's thoughts and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to help my own. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Before the throne, I stand incomplete. Jesus died, my soul to save. My lips shall still repeat. Jesus paid all to help my own. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. He washed it white as snow. He washed it white as snow.
So we're going to now pray for the offering, and we'll do our last song and be dismissed. Father in heaven, we come before you now. We thank you for the sacrifice of your Son. We thank you that everything you did through him on the cross for us, for our ability to be whole with you, Father. We just ask that you would, we just thank you for it. We just ask that you would show us that throughout the week, Father. That love that you have for us is there. Father, we pray for the offering as it is about to be taken. We ask that you bless the gift and the giver as we use it for ministry here. We pray, Father, that as we continue to seek ways of how to minister and show you to the community, Father, you will just continue to reveal ways to us, Father. We ask this all in Jesus' name.